Belgian and French style ales. So Belgian beers, most common ones are going to be wheat beers, which essentially are Belgian style wheats. By definition, they also have coriander and orange peel spices added to them. Belgian style pale ales, which are usually basically fairly hop forward beers fermented with Belgian yeast strains. And you have your Belgian strongs, and then you have Belgian golden strongs versus Belgian dark strongs. Then you have actually Belgian just pale strong ales as well, which are somewhat different. They're a bit more hoppy than just sort of Belgian strongs. And then you have your Flemish beers, specifically in the Flemish and the Flanders region of Belgium, which is kind of the northwest. And it kind of runs into France as well, in the northwest part of Belgium. And this is where you're going to find some of the classic sour beers of Belgium, things like your Flanders style red ales, which are red beers in color that usually age in oak for a very long time, for upwards of a year to 3 years, on mixed cultures of wild yeast and bacterial strains and Saccharomyces strains. And they become extremely acidic over time in the oak, the ingress of oxygen, just the mixed culture itself. These beers are kind of the only ones in the world too that find acetic acid somewhat acceptable, at least in low amounts and threshold levels. Oud Bruin, which essentially is a Flanders style old brown, is what it means, are usually fermented. They can be fermented in oak. Often they're just fermented in stainless, and they will usually just have a Saccharomyces and or Brettanomyces strain and Lactobacillus. There's usually a lack of Pediococcus of mixed culture fermentation beyond just Lactobacillus and Saccharomyces. Usually faster fermenters, they ferment a little bit quicker. You can get them out in 4 to 8 weeks sometimes, and oftentimes they're blended back to cut down on the sour products, or parts rather. So sometimes a lot of breweries, for example, will make Oud Bruin and make it extremely acidic in oak, and then use fresh versions of this brown ale to sort of blend it back with the old brown in order to cut the acidity. And they're oftentimes sweet with a touch of acidity on the back end. Then you have your Lambic, which is brewed traditionally in sort of central, near Brussels, parts of Belgium to south and southwest parts of Belgium. So you have different types of Lambic. Lambic is a spontaneously fermented beer. So you usually have to do a very intense mash schedule, usually called a turbid mash. That can take hours and hours to do. The idea there is locking in extremely complex carbohydrates for prolonged aging in barrels with mixed cultures. Essentially, you're creating food and for the mixed cultures that'll last 3-4 years sometimes. A goose is a type of lambic that's actually a blended version of a young, which is usually around a year-old lambic, and an old lambic, which is usually around 3 years old. So they'll take a very old, complex lambic and blend it back with a young version. And this also will promote the re-fermentation in the bottle, because oftentimes when you're blending goose, you'll take a 3-year-old lambic for the most part. Most of the product is that one, the highest percentage of the blend. And then some of the younger lambic that hasn't 100% completely developed as mature as sort of the older lambic. And then you'll bottle it and let the bottle sit for 6 months to a year. And the new lambic will begin to ferment and grow and develop in bottle and create a natural re-fermentation in the bottle. And that's goose. Fruit lambics there's tons of them. Framboise, for example, is a raspberry lambic. There's Pêche, which is a peach lambic. There's Kriek, which is a cherry lambic. So you'll take the lambics and basically between the 2 to 3 year range, add fruit to the barrels, and then just let that sit for an additional 4 months to a year even sometimes. Your Trappist ales. Trappist ales are actually brewed by the monks, actually in monasteries. So there aren't many of them in the world, but there are a few, and they're very good. Chimay being, for example, a very common one. Westvleteren is a great one as well. And so these are all Trappist ales, essentially they are brewed by the monks. They are monastic beers. They're also called abbey ales, except a Trappist ale can only be called a Trappist ale if the monks themselves are actually brewing it. So if a brewery, for example, here in town in St. Petersburg, were to brew a single, double, triple, and a quad, they can't call their beers Trappist. They can call them abbey style. So they're brewed in the style of Trappist. So they're abbey style ales. Same thing, just that's sort of the signifying difference between those names. So Trappist ales, traditionally singles, or they call them six sometimes. These are usually around 6% alcohol by volume, blonde, Belgian fermented beers, somewhat similar to Belgian strong pales, but specifically with abbey Trappist yeast strains. Doubles are usually around 8% alcohol, between the 6 to 8% range usually, and they will often use a lot more modified grains, roasted grains, and they'll often use amber to dark Belgian candy syrups. And the singles will sometimes and often use clear candy syrups in Belgian tradition. Triple is higher in alcohol than single and double, usually anywhere between the 8 and 9% range. And essentially is kind of an imperial version of the single. They're golden in color, they're big and fruity. A lot of the complexities from the yeast are bubble gum and banana and clove, lots of phenolic clove. And they're just big, fruity, yeast-forward ales, often using, obviously, candy syrups as well. So a bigger version of the single. And then you have quad, which is kind of the bigger version of the double. So darker in color, usually very, very rich. I mean, almost black in color. Big, dark fruit aromatics and flavor profiles, plum, date, fig, creamy. All of these are supposed to have very moussey-like head retention, and just sort of a bigger version of double. And the quads usually find themselves anywhere between 10% and 14% usually, alcohol by volume. Then we have our Franco-Belgian style beers. So these are beers that really were produced in kind of Wallonia, French-speaking provinces of Belgium. So they're Franco-Belgian style beers, which for the most part is the southern part of Belgium. So south of Brussels, a bit into France, but specifically just the southern part near the Ardennes sort of mountains and on farmlands. So specifically the mountains when he's talking about grisettes, because this is where a lot of coal mining was done, and those beers were specifically brewed for the coal miners in Wallonia. Saison is definitely the most popular version of farmhouse ale, of the Franco-Belgian style beer. Saison was brewed for the farmhands in Wallonia, so if you owned a farm, for example, you would brew Saison in the wintertime, and it was called Saison because it was seasonal. It was only made for the harvest season. So they would brew Saison in the wintertime, fermented out with sort of house cultures of yeast, which really were probably wild yeast strains and or mixed cultures, similar to in characteristics somewhat to Lambic and Flemish style mixed cultures, albeit fermented differently. So you would usually ferment Saison, for example, in your farmhouse, in the barn, in oak, and it would sit for upwards of 6 months before the harvest, and they would pour and serve Saison for the farmhands to sustain them as they harvested from the land. And so Saison was usually lower in alcohol because it was meant to be drank while you're working in the day. And its malt bill, its sort of fermentable makeup, almost entirely was made up from things that would have been laying around at the time on the farmland. So nothing very expensive. And then we have Bière de Garde. Bière de Garde is called the best beer, basically is what it means. And so if you owned one of these plantations, one of these farmlands, and you had a guest, for example, stay over in your home, you would serve them Bière de Garde. You wouldn't serve them Saison, which was cheap and easy to make, and for the farmhands, Bière de Garde was the best beer. And it often used more expensive ingredients, so modified grains, somewhat similar in its makeup, malt-forward characteristics at least, of double. So you'd use a lot of roasted grains, toasted grains, things that kind of required, I guess, more money, to buy sort of the ingredients. However, the Bière de Gardes were, for the most part, fermented similarly to Saison. So they were fermented with the same sort of old world yeast strains and mixed cultures and oak usually, and then served for kind of the best beer served in the house alone. And then you have Grisette. Grisette was, again, coal miners. It was a low alcohol, very similar to Saison in its makeup and in its fermentation capacity, or rather yeast makeup and mixed culture formulation. It was often like Saison. Also, the formation of its grist was very similar. It was stuff that was kind of laying around, not necessarily things that are very expensive or hard to come by. And then the one that's I'm actually looks like I'm in the way of is table beer. So table beer is a low alcohol beer that was usually drank at the table. So when you're sitting at the table about to have dinner or having dinner, or as I like to describe it, usually table beer was the beer that you would drink in preparation for dinner. So oftentimes wine was still something that people would drink, or something like a bière de garde or a lambic or bigger beers or wheat beers and things like that with dinner. So oftentimes table beer was the beer that you would drink while you're preparing the food, because it's low alcohol, usually sub 4% alcohol by volume, but also very complex and often barrel aged and fermented in the same manner as Saison, Bière de Garde, and Grisette were. All right, so American style ales. So we have things like our blonde ales and our golden ales, very similar styles. Pale ales, American style pales, American style strong pales. These days they're even different types of American style pale ales. IPAs and imperial IPAs, India pale ales and double imperial pale ales essentially, or double IPAs. Amber and or red ales. Those are obviously different beers, but can sometimes be blended in some competitions. American style brown ales, American style black ales or black American ales. These are kind of black IPAs usually, or big black hoppy beers. American style stouts. So there's an American style stout, which is usually a hoppier, bigger version of just sort of an oatmeal stout or a dry stout, and usually thicker. And then there's American style imperial stout, which traditionally is a bit hoppier, drier, and roastier than its British style imperial stout counterpart. German and or international style ales. So German ales would be things like alt beers, Berliner Weiss and Goses, which are traditionally fermented with Saccharomyces ale strains. Hefeweizens, Dunkelweissens, which is our dark Weissens, Weissenbachs, which are essentially wheat versions of Bach. Kolsch, which again can sometimes find itself in hybrid, but is still technically considered a German style ale that is fermented with lager-like characteristics and lager-like techniques. And then you have international ales like your Australian pale ales, which usually aren't extremely hoppy. They're actually fairly malty and dark, very, very clean and dry. And then international pale ales, which find themselves kind of all over the board and kind of whatever they can essentially be, whatever kind of bitterness level or hop forward level. But the signifying hop characteristics of international pale ales are hops that don't come from America, is really what it means. No real U.S. grown hops. So Southern Hemisphere hops, Galaxy, Nelson, things from New Zealand or Australia, things from Europe as well, hop forward. But for the most part, it's usually Southern Hemisphere hops is what that's for. Common off flavors in beer, we'll talk about quickly. Acetaldehyde, which kind of comes off as this green apple characteristic. It comes from unhealthy yeast, and you can kind of get it in a lot of beers. This is something you're going to be looking for when you're evaluating beers. Alcohol and or hot, so really warming characteristics, hot characteristics. You ever hear that? That's specifically referring to alcohol characteristics, how hot it is, how much alcohol there is versus how perceived that alcohol is, because sometimes alcohol strength can be hidden, and that's usually considered a good thing, and alcohol heat and warming effects from ethanol itself usually not looked at as good characteristics in a beer. So I'm kind of covering part of it, so I'll read it off here. This comes from high fermentation temperatures usually, or just specifically from high alcohol. So you can get some fusel alcohols just from high alcohol temperatures, and you can get just warming ethanol characteristics just from having high alcohol, even though the fermentation temperatures might be good, and it might not be fusel alcohol characteristics, which come from high fermentation temperatures and yeast selection. It could just be that there's a lot of high alcohol in the product or booziness from barrel aging, for example, in a bourbon barrel and getting far too much of that sort of liquor booze. Diacetyl and or VDK, which is kind of another term for it, which is visceral decatones. That's what VDK stands for, which comes across as butter and or butterscotch, really popcorny kind of things. Usually comes from unhealthy yeast and or poor process. Some more common off flavors, DMS, dimethyl sulfide, kind of tastes like cooked corn. Excuse me. Which usually comes about from either a week and or a short boil. So if you boil for a long time, DMS or dimethyl sulfide often evaporates off. I'm sure we talked about this in sort of recipe formulation earlier, but if your boil is a little short or it's not rolling fast enough, you don't necessarily evaporate off all that DMS. And it could also come from your grist makeup. It is naturally on grains. So if you have a lot of Pilsner malt, for example, in a beer, that kind of encourages DMS. There's a ton of DMS you can get from just straight Pilsner malt. So having, for example, a healthier boil or a longer boil can oftentimes help get rid of DMS. Ester profiles come from high fermentation temperatures for the most part. They taste very fruity, specifically pear or citrus in sort of American ales. Banana is a common fruity ester profile, things like Hefeweizen, in some Belgian beers. And in some of those beers, it's very acceptable. So, and you can also sometimes get like a white grapey kind of characteristic as well from high fruity ester profiles. Oftentimes, this is considered like an okay, depending on the style of beer. Some beers, I mean, the guidelines will say whether or not ester profiles are good or bad. For the most part, in most beers, it comes from unhealthy yeast and or poor pitch rates. So you're either not pitching enough yeast or your yeast isn't healthy. But the most common result is usually high fermentation temperatures that encourage the production of esters from the yeast itself. All right, so we have light struck. Light struck is actually fairly common in a lot of beers, which is unfortunate. It comes off as like the stinky and or like skunky catty kind of characteristic. It's pretty offensive on the nose, especially, and it comes from an exposure to light. So if you see a beer in green bottles or clear bottles, they're definitely more susceptible to light struck characteristics than beers in brown bottles, and especially beers in cans, which no light gets through the aluminum. So you shouldn't have a light struck beer at all in, for example, packaging a can. Medicinal, which kind of is chloroseptic or a medicine cabinet is kind of what it smells like. This usually comes from just chlorine or chloramines that are in your brewing water. So if you don't have, for example, a carbon filter to remove chlorine and or chloramine in your water for your brewing water at the beginning of your brew, you can often get medicinal-like characteristics in the products. Metallic, which usually comes across as iron or copper, coins, blood. This is oftentimes has to do with the ions in your water. There might be metallic ions, so it has to do with your water profile, similar to what we just spoke about, having chlorines and chloramines and the medicinal sort of off flavors. Sometimes they could also come from your equipment not being properly passivated. So when a brewery gets stainless, for example, they usually run a nitric acid wash on it in order to passivate the stainless, because the stainless can impart metallic flavors if it doesn't go through this. Same thing with aluminum. If you don't create an oxide layer on the inside of aluminum, you can get metallic characteristics. This will often happen in home brewing if you use an aluminum pot instead of a stainless pot for boiling, which is fine. You just have to build an oxide layer first, which basically means you boil water in it, and the oxygen in the water will sort of change the color of the aluminum to this brown, and it'll absorb and take out all the metallic characteristics, and you can start boiling into it. Another common off flavor is oxidation. So this is usually tastes like a papery and or cardboard characteristic. Sometimes people describe it as slate. This usually is just an ingress of oxygen being introduced post-fermentation usually. During fermentation, it's not as much of a problem because yeast absorbs oxygen, and so it uses it to in its metabolic growth phase before fermentation. But if you introduce oxygen at any point after fermentation, whether it's dry hopping, transferring, packaging, all those things, your beer can taste like cardboard. And it also can go through a Maillard reaction and have a browning effect and get a bit caramely and sort of just, browning characteristics, really toasty, bready, and caramely where it's not supposed to. And warm beer storage does increase oxidation levels. So if there, for example, is you have a low or high DO, no matter what it is, if your beer is stored warm, the beer will react faster to oxygen than cold storage. Phenolic, there's different types of phenolic off flavors, so I kind of broke them down. One of the phenolic off flavors is plastic. It kind of comes off as Band-Aid, and this usually comes from lower fermentation temperatures and or low yeast health. The other type of phenolic is spicy, so like clove or pepper spice. These are often found in beers like Hefeweizen, again, has clove-like characteristics. A lot of Saison or Belgian-style beers will have a lot of pepper spice characteristics. Another, just on a side note real quick, another ester profile off flavor could sometimes be bubblegum, which sometimes it just reminded me, some of the Belgian beers will have bubblegum characteristic, and that is an ester, it's not a phenolic. Sour and or acidic characteristics. So there's a big difference between lactic acidity and acetic acidity. Lactic acidity is a lot cleaner, less harsh. Acetic is a bit harsher, stronger, lower, a lot of vinegar-like characteristics, which is not what lactic acid tastes like. And this usually can come from a bacterial infection if the beer obviously is not meant to be a sour beer. Some more off flavors here. Sulfur is a big one. It just smells like rotten eggs. This is usually a problem from yeast health. Sometimes you can just switch your yeast selection and get it, or your poor resting procedures. A lot of lager have sulfur characteristics, at least in fermentation. They have a high production of sulfur, actually. And the reason we say poor resting procedures can be a problem is because if you let the beer sit long enough, the volatiles of sulfur actually will evaporate off in fermentation, and you won't really have sulfur characteristics anymore as long as you let it sit long enough. Vegetal, which can come off as like cooked vegetables or sometimes even like kind of cooked corn, but that's usually DMS. This can often be the result of old raw materials. Your grain had been sitting for a long time and has gotten stale, which can sometimes give that flavor. Sometimes you can get vegetal characteristics just from hops, and it's an excessive use of fresh and or whole cone hops. So if you make a whole cone beer, dry hop with whole cone, tons of leaf hops in the boil and dry hop, oftentimes what you'll extract is not just hop flavor and sort of isomerization of alpha acids, but you'll start to actually taste like leaves and vegetal characteristics, like this vegetable matter that can come from the hops. This can also actually come from stalled fermentations and yeast health, poor yeast health. So vinegary, we mentioned earlier, lactic versus acetic. Acetic is vinegar. This comes from a bacterial infection and oxidation. So acetic acid is produced by Acetobacter, which is an aerobic bacterial strain, and it needs two things. It definitely, obviously, needs oxygen because it's aerobic, but the other thing that it needs is ethanol. So it's in a beer that is already a beer. It's already, fermentation has already happened, alcohol is already present, and then you have this Acetobacter, this bacterial infection, in the presence of oxygen and that ethanol creating vinegar. Yeasty, bready, sulfury kind of characteristics and flavor can all be from yeast itself. You can taste the yeast in suspension. High turbidity is actually a visual thing. You can see how turbid something is. If it looks like a vial of yeast in a glass, that's not a good thing. That's an off flavor. Usually results from low flocculation. You can have a poor flocculating yeast strain. Poor resting procedures. You're just not crashing the beer long enough or resting the beer long enough for all the yeast in suspension to flocculate out of suspension, and or poor clarification procedures. Pour procedures using fining agents, whether that be, isinglass or gelatin or biofine or even filtering, plate filters or centrifuge. Yeast in suspension shows obviously potential pour procedures in your clarification. And I believe that is it. So yeah, thanks guys so much. Hope the rest of Module 9 and then Module 10 treat you well. We'll see you in the brewery. Cheers.